I just want to go through and make sure. Okay, good. Make sure all my notes are in here.
You're swift on that button there, I tell you.
I am. I'm going to try to keep pace though, Bill.
Okay, that's okay.
Well, we wanted to see that. Oh, welcome. We're glad you're awake after lunch. Both Bill and Hannah were supposed to be here, but due to weather, so we transitioned into doing it virtual. So thank you for putting up with our technology disadvantages today. Having said that, I'm not going to go into their lengthy bio, especially for Bill, who's been in aid for a long time. So he's our financial aid veteran extraordinaire. And Hannah Brown, she's the director of financial aid at Merritt University. And with that, I'm going to open it up. Later on, when they do have the question session, I'll be monitoring and letting them know. So if you speak loud enough, they'll be able to hear you and answer them. Bill and Hannah, take it away.
Okay, as Evelyn said, we certainly had planned on being present at spring training in the East. We're also presenting, we knew, remotely in the West, but unfortunately the unpredictable weather up here in Northeast Pennsylvania sort of hampered us from doing that traveling. So we're trying to make the best of it with all the technical help from the PASFA conference committee. So let's begin, Hannah.
All righty.
Okay, so first I want to just review with you. I'm going to go over more of the easy stuff in today's presentation because I've been off of working full-time on a college campus for a little while. Certainly I was a director of financial aid at the University of Scranton when the pandemic began, but soon exited afterwards. But so Hannah's going to handle more of the on-campus sections, but let me talk to a little bit what we're addressing today. We're going to review the COVID-19 resources, which were plenty of documents sent by the Department of Ed. We're going to review the Title IV flexibilities and waiver chart. That is a very key document to the expiration of many of these waivers. We're going to go over a definition of terms with financial aid. That's always very important. And we're going to talk about the planned end of the pandemic emergency declaration, which President Biden has chosen as my birth date, May 11th. So that's sort of ominous, I think. And we're going to go over some of the expired flexibility and waivers, not in great detail because they've expired. But just to make sure the audience is knowledgeable about what was, we're going to talk a little bit about the ending flexibilities and waivers that are going to be occurring in the short term, and then those that are going to be a little bit longer term. And we're going to talk at the end, talk a little bit about strategies that you may be employing on your own campuses. Okay, and here's a review of, and I try to extract these announcements from the January 16 chart that's going to appear shortly, but I try to put them in chronological order as the Department of Education released information, and you know, it's just there for historical content. And when we take a look at the actual chart, we're going to show how you could actually reference any of these documents by clicking on the link. Next slide there. So you can see, again, very lengthy. And the last note there is the January 15th, 2021 electronic announcement. And this includes the link to all of the waivers announcements that are preceded this one. Now, I do want to make wait, hold 1 second, one backwards here a second, just one. I do want to make one observation here. The Department of Education has said this January 16 chart, where much of this presentation was extracted from, is self-implementing. That means that you should not need to await any further guidance from the Department of Education. It's all contained in information within the chart. Waiting would be like being at a bus stop on a route that was canceled. So, be careful there. You need to proceed with what you have already from the department. So let's go again. Next slide there. Okay, and this is an example of the January 16 chart. And you can see it's broken down into 3 different columns. It lists the flexibility, the waiver. It gives the timeline that's applicable. And then you can see on the very right side additional information, but you can see that the links are there so that if you want more details, you just need to simply click on the link. And Hannah, I don't know if you had a time to just bring up the document.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring this on over and you let me know if you can see this.
And then just give them an example on how any.
So this is a copy of the flexibility chart provided by the Department of Ed, and going through it, I mean, it is 19 to 20 pages long, but on each part of the chart, they do offer in blue or hyperlinked here the specific law or regulation on that. So I usually just do like open in a new tab. But if you click on this link, it should open, you should be able to open, actually, I think because I opened it in Google, it doesn't want to do it. But the stuff in blue, this is my version, our version highlighted. But if you click on this, it will open that specific guidance to the Department of Ed's website. So that's just for reference.
Good, very good. Thank you.
Yep.
And next slide here. Okay, so really the definitions of time vary throughout that document. They use multiple expiration dates, many that have been already passed, so they're ended. Some are based on the end date of the national emergency, which is now scheduled to be May 11th. In some cases, they use actual dates. Most of those have been passed, so a certain date is referenced. It's already passed. In other cases, they say a number of days after the end date or after a period. An example would be 180 days after some event. In other cases, award year is used. Now, the Title IV definition of an award year is a time period between July 1st through June 30th. But that could vary from school to school as to within that time period what they're selecting. Academic year is another thing that is more institutional and variable. Payment period. Many of the exemptions for waivers and flexibilities will end at the end of the payment period, which includes the end date, May 11th, the end of the next payment period. Now here I want to caution you is that especially if you're at a school that has multiple payment periods, some that begin after or before that May 11th, you have to pay particular attention to how the students that are enrolled in that particular payment period, what provisions still are active for them and what have expired. I don't know in the room there, does anyone, and Evelyn, you could let us know, does anyone have a date where May 11th is between the end of a payment period and the beginning of a next? I can't see anybody raising their hand, but certainly that would be a concern. If you're a clock hour school, you may have multiple payment periods where it starts and ends. So when you read those sections where it references payment period, you have to be particularly careful how it applies to your school. Now, there's one reference of fiscal year. It's unclear, but I would assume they were talking about January 1st through December 31st as being a fiscal year. And that was really only applicable to a wage program in the Perkins loan repayment. So I don't think it's such a big deal, but it was a little bit, the only time I saw fiscal year reference. Next slide there. Okay, and this is, I think, where Hannah's going to talk a little bit about those provisions that are already expired or, as you can see, out of the ballpark.
Yeah, so these flexibilities and waivers on this slide are maybe some things that you've already had to implement or I guess stop doing since they have since expired. So one of the things was the additional days for leave of absences. So institutions were allowed to put a student on a leave of absence or allow them to use a leave of absence through December 31st, 2020. So that's why that's currently expired. The automatic waiver of work study and SEOG underuse, that applied only to award year 21-22. So that is also expired. The waiver of the campus-based matching requirements, there was a waiver on the institutional match for those programs. That was only for the 1920 school year and the 2020-2021 school year. Some of the Perkins loan provisions that allowed institutions to cease collection activities that expired on December 31st of 2020. The section 3513 of the CARES Act that allowed for temporary federal loan relief using the CARES Act, which currently is under the HEROES Act, I believe. So the part of the federal loan pause that was implemented using the CARES Act has since expired. Now the forbearance on federal loans is, I think, under a provision of the HEROES Act. So that's the only difference there. And then for non-single audit submissions, they were allowing for an additional 6 months after the original deadline to submit non-single audit submissions. That has also since passed. So those are some of the things that have expired or flexibilities that you no longer have the option of using. But there are also still very many flexibilities and waivers that you're still able to perform for, I guess, the current year and moving forward. So Bill's going to go over.
Okay, so again, a little bit of a repeat of what I said. The end of the payment period that includes the end date of the national emergency. And again, I know that varies from school to school and type of school. I know my son works for a community college, and I think his term ends May 8th, which is before the end of the national emergency. And I'm not quite certain when the next term or payment period begins for the program that he's involved with. So again, you have to be careful. Some is the end of the next payment period. Now here, especially if you're in a traditional school that has scheduled academic terms, you do have to be careful here because oftentimes some of us don't think of as summer as being the next payment period, but of course, indeed it is. So when it says the end of the next payment period, that includes the end date for many schools, that would be the end of their summer terms. The end of the award year, that includes the end date. And again, the award year is referencing the federal award year. The end of the next award year, that includes the end date. So, for example, if we consider some may end at the end of the 22-23 award year, other provisions may end at the end of the 23-24 award year for some schools. The end of the academic year, which is a separate term from award year, and the end of the next academic year. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it could be a specified number of days after the end date, like 180 days.
Okay, so I'm going to be going over some of the flexibilities and waivers that end for the payment period that includes the last date of the national emergency. So to give an example, like Bill had said, if you're in a traditional, maybe semester-based school, that would probably include your spring semester if May 11th is included as part of your spring semester. So for schools or institutions where May 11th is after the end of the spring semester, these waivers and flexibilities might be applying to maybe your summer terms. And that's why it's so important to kind of familiarize yourself with your award year or your payment period so that you know exactly what term these waivers and flexibilities would apply to. So the first thing would be the R2T4 waiver, in which institutions were not required to return funds if a student withdrew as a result of a qualifying event or a related COVID-19 emergency. So that waiver will be no longer an option for institutions as of the end of maybe your spring semester, if that's the case. The Pell LEU, the Department of Ed was not counting towards students' Pell LEU any funds that were given to the student after maybe a withdrawal or a qualifying event due to COVID. So that's another flexibility that will be ending. The cancellation of Teach Grant and direct loan funds basically is the same concept as the Pell LEU. So if a student had withdrawn and had received Teach or direct loan payments, the Department of Ed has not been including that as part of their borrowing limits or their program limits. For full transfer of the, reporting amount for CARES Act relief for withdrawal student was the next one. That one was basically that if a student had withdrawn, those direct loan funds or Teach Grant funds needed to be reported to the Department of Education. So again, that flexibility is ending. The full transfer of federal work study funds to SEOG. Bill's going to be going over this in a little bit more detail at the end of our presentation, but basically you should be able to transfer 100% of any of your unused federal work study allocation to SEOG, and this will likely be the last time that you're able to do that. So at the end of the presentation, when we go over some of your options and ways to prepare for these waivers ending, pay particular attention to that section of the presentation. For the SEOG emergency grants, schools were allowed to offer these emergency grants of SEOG for unexpected expenses or unmet financial need to Pell eligible or high financial need students. So again, we would no longer be able to make those emergency grant payments to students using our SEOG funds. And then for work study wages, I know this happened to me when I was a work study at Messiah, but when the pandemic first started, if a student's work study job was interrupted, the school was still allowed to pay that student any work study wages if their employment was interrupted due to COVID. And then lastly, for the SAP allowances, if a student had attempted credits but was unable to complete them as a result of the pandemic or related circumstance, those credits could be excluded from the quantitative component of SAP, which would be their PACE calculation. And so to give a brief example, I know at my institution, we calculate satisfactory academic progress after the end of the spring semester. So I don't believe this would apply to our institution. It would be if you're calculating SAP or determining a SAP calculation during that payment period, because as of the end of your spring semester, this will no longer be an option. So at least for us, if I calculate a student's SAP calculation after May 11th, which I usually would do in the case because our spring semester ends on, I think, the 15th. So just pay particular attention to when your term is ending and if that flexibility would still apply to you. A couple other ones was the NSLDS in-school deferment allowance. If schools had to cease operations or if student attendance was interrupted, there were some flexibilities on NSLDS reporting. The Clary Act allowances, this one, I don't know that many financial aid offices would be much included in this reporting process, but if there was an immediate threat to health or safety, that goes back to the Clary Act requirement from institutions where in this case, you would have to notify your campus, maybe just a singular notification about COVID-19, what your institution was originally doing to maybe offer testing services to your students, if there were students who tested positive on campus. So that was kind of a requirement of the Clary Act. And they kind of gave you a flexibility in that, where you could just send one singular notification about the COVID-19 pandemic, or have a banner on your home, maybe your institution's homepage, with a link to the department's website on COVID and testing options. So that was one of the flexibilities. For need analysis, any of those SEOG emergency grants that you may have distributed to your students, the flexibility with that was that those were not going to be included as estimated financial aid or estimated financial assistance in their need analysis. So moving forward, you know, any of those grants or any grant like that would have to be counted in the student's need analysis. And then lastly, if any of the institutions were on heightened cash management 1, they were allowed to submit requests for funding without first paying credit balances to students. So that was one of the last flexibilities. And again, that includes any payment period that includes the last date of the pandemic. So usually maybe at the end of your spring semester. And then to move on, we're going to talk about any of the waivers and flexibilities that would apply for the payment period that begins after the last date of the national emergency. So for maybe most traditional institutions, that could be, you know, your summer term. Again, I think we're just trying to make this as general as possible, and, you know, pay attention to exactly when that date falls in on your academic calendar. But for the ability to place students on leave of absence without student requests, schools were able to grant a leave of absence prior to a student requesting it if the institution was temporarily closed or unable to continue instruction. So that flexibility would end maybe at the end of the summer or your next payment period. Students who are returning from a leave of absence for term-based programs originally would have to resume training at the point at which they left that program and went on that leave of absence. There's a waiver for that requirement as well. For the notifying the direct loan servicer, if a student could not attend the institution or program due to the institution closing, the school would just have to notify the loan servicer that the student did not begin attendance. But there would be no longer the requirement to notify the servicer of the living expenses that were paid for the student. Certain distance education allowances. This one is a lot more thorough. Again, that flexibility chart that we had linked there, if you can get access to that and use that as reference, there's a ton of information on there about any sort of distance education allowances or flexibilities. But the general waiver of the state authorization requirements to provide distance ed programs, that was just a big change, and there was a waiver allowed for schools having to provide written authorizations or agreements to offer distance education courses. And then here, so any of the waivers and flexibilities that begin after the last date of the national emergency, the payment period that begins after the last date of the national emergency, this is just continued. Verification flexibilities. So originally with the V4 and V5 documentation, that stuff had to be signed in person. But if a student was unable to get that signed in person, or they were unable to get it notarized, there was a flexibility for institutions to receive those in a different way to still process the V4 or V5 verification. For students who were unable to, or if institutions were unable to get a signature from a parent, if the student was not able to get a parent signature, there was a flexibility for that requirement. Non-filing and W-2s. So I remember when I first started at Marywood, this was a big thing. It was during the height of the pandemic when the IRS was very, very backlogged, and they weren't able to get those non-filing letters to students or, you know, parents in some cases. So that flexibility is still continuing, but it will end at the end of the next payment period after the end of the national emergency. So I think originally, as long as the student was making a good faith effort to get a non-filing document and they had signed a statement, the school could accept the statement of that instead of the actual IRS document. And then for high school completion documentation, schools were actually allowed to use instead any sort of high school completion documentation on file, maybe from the admissions office. or anything that you would have had from a previously processed V4 or V5 instead of going back and requesting that a second time. And a quick note here that we thought was important is that these verification flexibilities would apply to any verification that you're currently processing. So that could be for this academic year, the 22-23 year, or if you've started processing verification already for 23-24, these flexibilities would still apply regardless of what year verification you're processing. It's just that they would end at the end of the next payment period after that May 11th date. So.
Hannah, just let me, I think to clarify that,
Sure.
I think that would pertain to like a summer period where some students, you may be using the 22-23 FAFSA and Pell Student Aid Index or EFC to calculate an award versus some other student using the 23-24, but if I'm not mistaken, I think actually it's the student would have to be in that payment period that occurs after the end date.
Enrolled in that payment period?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Unless someone else in the audience has a different spin on that. That's the way I
Right.
interpreted it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of them can be up for interpretation sometimes. So.
But remember, you're not going to get any further guidance, so.
True. Yeah. Okay. So then Bill also mentioned that some of these flexibilities want to be complicated and they want to have these crazy special dates or, X amount of days after. So here we just tried to break down some of the things from that flexibilities chart that we identified that had some sort of special end date. So the waiver on being able to do any sort of accreditation site visits, they allowed for those to be virtual. So that flexibility would end 180 days after May 11th. For the MCAT and the USMLE waiver, I know there's actually two different dates for these, or at least the USMLE waiver that wasn't announced until a separate Department of Ed announcement. So they weren't in the same announcement. So just keep that in mind. But these waivers on these are mostly for, it seems to me, mostly for foreign graduate medical school requirements for MCAT and the USMLE tests and waivers. So this would end after, I think you're mainly allowed to continue using this waiver for the duration of the admissions year, which to me seems up for interpretation as well. I don't know, Bill, if you had anything on that one.
Actually, I think that's one term I missed on my slide. I'm not sure what that, I think the admission year could vary from school to school, so that's a good one.
Right. So short-term program completion, originally schools, if you had a short-term completion or a short-term program, you would have had to report on the number or the percentage of students who, graduate and have a certain, are going into job completion or job placement rates. So that requirement originally was like 70%. If you had a short-term program, at least 70% of those students had to have completed a specific job or had been placed in a certain job. So the waiver on that would end during the award year, the end of the award year. So I'm assuming, if May 11th is part of this current award year, then it would probably be the end of whatever award year you're currently in. So provisions related to teaching services. I think this mainly applies to the TEACH program, the TEACH grant program, and it also seems like it provides to teacher loan forgiveness programs. So if there were extenuating circumstances in which the student could not work full-time or complete any of the requirements of those programs, they were allowing flexibilities for that as well. So any of those provisions or flexibilities would end as of the end date of the national emergency. So that would end as of May 11th. Change of ownership reporting requirements. This is, I think, an important one. I don't know that it happens very often, but any sort of change in ownership of your institution would normally require an approval of that change from the accreditor and also financial statements. So any of those requirements for change of ownership would be ending 180 days after May 11th. And then temporary instruction cessation. So if an institution had to close, or if there was closure or pause due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they had to at least resume instruction no later than the beginning of the next payment period after the end of the national emergency. So, okay, and we have a couple more. So federal work study community service waivers, that 7% requirement of institutions to employ students in community service positions, that will not be ending until the end of the next award year. So I think, to give an example, for maybe a traditional four-year private or public school, that could mean the end of probably next, so 23, 24. So you still wouldn't have to have that that 7% employment in place for next school year, although it's probably a good idea to try to achieve that regardless, just knowing that it would be ending. Bill will be going over that a little bit, as I said. The allowance of overlapping terms, that's also the end of the current award year. And then standard terms as few as 13 weeks. Any sort of standard terms that you had, that were less than 13 weeks, that waiver would also end as of the current award year. So they're very similar, but even just throwing in the word next instead of current kind of changes everything. So it's important to pay attention to the specific language on each of the waivers and flexibilities. That's a lot.
Okay.
So.
Evelyn, before we, go into the final portion of the presentation, could you sort of look around? Is there any questions that of Hannah or myself that for the information already discussed, that someone has a question or clarification? Don't be shy.
You're still awake, so that's good.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay.
Okay.
So let's talk about things where you want to play it safe. And Hannah already mentioned a little bit about that when she referred to the community service requirement being pushed forward to the end of the next award year. But let me talk a little bit about things that you should be planning to do on your campuses. And when the pandemic occurred and some of these waivers were allowed, or flexibilities, I'm sure many of you made updates to your website, whether it was about verification requirements or signature requirements or whatever. You may have made updates to your website. So now what do you do when you're faced with some of these flexibilities and waivers changing over a period of time, not all at once? It may make it difficult to remove something that could still apply for some students, especially if you have multiple payment periods on your campus. So you may want to take a careful look at your website to see, maybe it's prudent for some schools to put in a notation leaving the waiver that could be still applicable, and listing underneath or aside it some notation that particular waiver or requirement or procedure at your school will be changing effective a certain date. So these are some of the things I think you need to be careful. Or if something ended and you thought your parents or students could be confused about, well, I didn't have to do this or that before, you may want to list that as this is no longer applicable, something of that. So I think, again, every campus's website is a little bit different, but you may want to start making those plans now because things are going to happen very quickly and not all at once. What type of communication plan do you have? Here again, if you have to communicate changes to your students and parents, maybe you need to devise something that is out of the ordinary for you on your campus, but you feel that would be a good way to alert students and parents of things that are going to change or have already changed. And also the communication plan may have to include communicating with campus colleagues that you have if in fact some of these changes impact them. Of course, Hannah already mentioned something about the Clery Act, and certainly that's not something we administer in the financial aid office, but I think you know that in many cases, your institution relies upon you to communicate almost anything that has an impact on participation in the higher education Title IV program. So you may want to think about that. So again, alert any campus colleagues that are most involved. Certainly that could include your admissions office, your enrollment manager, your bursar, your student accounts, anything that's changing, you might want to make them aware of that. And certainly on your campus, whoever your immediate supervisor is, you want to sort of not present this detailed information that we're going over today, but you probably want to communicate what are the most important changes that impacts the institution at a sort of a higher level. Okay, so that way your supervisor, whether they're an enrollment manager or, provost or, vice president of finance, that they're aware of the most pertinent changes that may impact the campus that you're on. Now, review campus funding. I'm going to go over this a little bit in more detail in a second here, but this is very important because of the changes in ability to transfer the funds, work study to SEOG. You already heard Hannah mention that that's going to end at the end of this award year when the May 11th end date of the national emergency. So that's a key factor. The other is, as Hannah had already mentioned, the pending work study community service requirement that for many of you will be delayed until the 24-25 academic year. But here's the thing you want to consider there. I know on some campuses, it's at times difficult to fulfill that 7% requirement. And it really depends on the campus, where you're located, what the opportunities are for students to do this type of service in the community, how open your campus is to serving outside entities, people on your campus. But just think about what happened during this pandemic. I mean, in many cases, students would have been unwelcome to go out into the community and do this type of work. And in many cases, our campuses were pretty sheltered in allowing people that weren't directly connected to the campus to visit and be serviced. So this has been a 3-year period almost where this has existed. And so even though many of you have this 2023-24 year to prepare, as Hannah suggested, you may want to start, gearing up in a more directive way to begin meeting that 7% community service. The people you may have dealt with outside of the campus may not be employed in those positions any longer. They may not be familiar with the community service where students are able to assist them. And then others where you may have had services available on your campus that qualified. You may find that attracting students or people in the community back to those services may be a little bit more difficult. So think about that. So let's look at the next slide, Hannah, there, please. Mm-hmm. Okay, so campus-based funding strategies. And I always take pride that I actually prepared over my years about 40 FISAP reports. God love me. But I'm always proud that never once, I never sent $1 back to the federal government. I always made sure those funds were available to our students, no matter how we did it, carry them forward, carry them back, whatever the case may be. And this could, the change in the waivers could impact your school's ability to make sure that you capture all of those funds to help students. So what I would encourage you is to, right now, work with your finance division, sit down and make sure where you are on track to spend all of your funds, or at least if you can't spend all of your funds, the ability to carry it over into a next award year, because I don't think you want to get in a position of not using all of the funding available, because it can impact future year funding requests for your school. So I've encouraged schools that I've talked with to take a good look now. And while you still have the ability to transfer 100% of work-study funds, if they're not going to be used for wages for the remainder of the award year, into SEOG, keeping in mind that you have the ability again to use those for regular SEOG awards, which you have to follow all of the regulations, that's a separate, or the emergency SEOG program, which could include giving higher awards differently than you do in SEOG awards. And if you have a graduate student population, you could also provide emergency FSEOG awards to graduate students. So there's multiple ways, and I would advise you to take a good look at the Federal Student Aid Handbook on how you could carry forward and carry back funds, the ability to use future award year funds from the May and June for wages and work study or SEOG awards, the ability to carry forward and carry back. So there is a lot of flexibility in the programs. And I think what you want to put yourself in a position is to make sure not only that you spend all of your funds, or at least make them available for next award year, but that you take a look into the next award year to make sure you're prepared to be fully utilizing these campus-based funds. And that's all I had about that there. And so now, Evelyn, can we open the floor to some questions? We certainly entertain them. Don't be shy now. I know I think I had a message from, is Fran McEwen in the audience there anywhere? Fran, I want you to see that I have my Irish on today, you know. In Scranton, we celebrate St. Patrick's Day all week here. Evelyn, any questions?
Not that I can see.
Well, we certainly want to thank the audience for participating. I do want to add, I think, I believe I saw Greg Gearhart's face there in the audience earlier. Greg, are you still there?
Yeah.
Well, I think you could be very proud of Hannah here, having been your work study students for all those years. And here she is doing a PASFA presentation as Director of Student and Financial Aid at Marywood University. So and she did a great job. She did the hard part.
Yeah.
No,
Greg or Bill looped me into this unknowingly. He caught me in a different meeting and he's like, do you want to come and present with me? And I was like, he said, you could be my right hand. I'm like, okay. And then he goes, so you're going to be doing all the hard parts of the presentation. And I'm just going to do the general stuff. I'm like, great, that works.
Well, there we go. So
Anna, we have a lot of first timers here, so you could do that to them, pay it forward.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's a good point, Evelyn. And you know, I encourage everyone to, like Hannah has, step up and get involved in PASFA. Don't be afraid. It's always nice if you could find someone to work with that's experienced, because the benefits of PASFA and working with colleagues. I was telling Hannah this morning, I was on a Zoom meeting last evening at 8 o'clock with Dan Ray. God bless him. Like, you know, such a resource, and to be able to tap into that And I had a very big technological problem here. I realized that for some reason, my camera wasn't working, and I couldn't view myself when I was testing the video for today's presentation. So Dan set up a Zoom meeting. We got on, and of course I said, Dan, I don't know. I tried all the settings. It looks like I did everything right. Maybe my camera's broke. And he said, well, Bill, you don't have a piece of tape over your lens, do you? And I said, no, Dan. I said, but I did have one of those slide things that fell off a while ago. And I went up and I sort of, and he said, wait, I think I could see your finger. Here I had, I think the paste from the slide was blocking the screen or the camera. So the big technological problem solved by Dan Ray. So.
Yeah, I'm glad this worked out and we were able to do it virtually.
Okay, sorry we couldn't be there in person. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes,
Well, Bill and Hannah, we appreciate it.
no problem.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yep,
Thank
good job,
you.
Hannah.
You too.
Thank you.